Everybody. Welcome, everybody. I'm Karim Bardisi, Executive Director of the DAIS, which is the host of the TMU Democracy Forum with Martin Regg Cohn. Thank you so much for coming here at Toronto Metropolitan University. We'll be getting going in a moment. There is a live feed happening here, and thanks to all the team members of the DAIS, TMU, the consulate, the embassy, Brian and the AV team, the security team at TMU. We'll be starting shortly. There'll be a Slido for questions. The questions and answers session will be after Martin's own questions to the ambassador will be on Slido, and the code will be flashing there, so you can just kind of turn your camera over there, zoom in on it, and the code is right there. Actually, it's right there right now. And with that, I'm very happy to, is it now 2:30? Is it the time? So you might see some people still coming in, traffic and elevator speeds not being as fast as they need to be sometimes. Very happy to welcome the Provost and VP Academic of Toronto Metropolitan University, Roberta Inachito Provenzano, to the stage, who will provide a welcome.
Thank you very much, Karim. Good afternoon. As Karim said, my name is Roberta Inachito Provenzano. His pronunciation was pretty good. And I am the Provost and Vice President Academic at TMU. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our Democracy Forum, hosted by the DAIS. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the history of the land that we're on today. As part of my own journey towards truth and reconciliation, I'm privileged and proud to be one of the three co-chairs of the university's TRC Strategic Working Group. Through this leadership role, I continue to put in the work to learn Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and thinking, and to learn and unlearn, mainly unlearn, colonial ways of thinking. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the treaty and protect the land. As a newcomer that has been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect, I'm committed to using my leadership role to help indigenize teaching and learning practices and improve support for the Indigenous community at TMU. I encourage everyone to consider their relationship to the land and Indigenous peoples. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the DAIS for supporting the Democracy Forum. As many of you know, the Democracy Forum is a non-partisan platform for politicians and practitioners to engage in dialogue and increase democratic engagement. I'm looking forward to hearing from our special guest today, who will be formally introduced shortly. Today we'll bring an insightful discussion with the U.S. Ambassador to Canada. As an institution, TMU believes in fostering dialogue and debate as our teaching, learning, and research are driven by the diversity of ideas and experiences of our community. Our moderator today is Martin Regg Cohn, a political columnist at the Toronto Star covering Queen's Park. Founder of the Democracy Forum at TMU, Martin is not only a good friend, but also a senior fellow at the DAIS on campus and a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He was a foreign correspondent for 11 years in Asia and the Middle East, and also a foreign editor and parliamentary correspondent. Happy to join today, and I'm sure there will be a lively and interesting discussion. And without further ado, I'll toss it over to Martin. Thank you.
Thank you. Bienvenue, bonjour, welcome to the Democracy Forum at Toronto Metropolitan University, where we try to do democracy differently and democratically. If you're watching us on the star.com live or on the CPAC television network, thanks for joining us. I always remind people this is not a news conference, it's not a confrontation, it's a democracy forum where we try to dig a little deeper and get more in-depth answers from our guests. So let me tell you about today's guest. David Cohen is the United States Ambassador to Canada. He was appointed 3 years ago by President Joe Biden, and he was confirmed by the US Senate unanimously, miraculously, given how divided they all are. Now, the ambassador had a life before diplomacy in law and politics and the politics of law. He started out as chief of staff to the mayor of Philadelphia, which is a very political city. He ran one of America's biggest law firms, and he ended up in the top leadership of Comcast, which is the biggest cable and internet company in America. It also owns a television network, NBC, and a supposedly trendy lefty cable news outlet, MSNBC. Now, in my research, I found an old press clipping from the Washington Post, so it must be true, which described him as a wonk rock star. You're looking at him with the Diet Coke. It's part of the contract. There's Diet Coke in the dressing room as well. While he was at Comcast. He was also, though, its chief diversity officer. So he was a champion. I see Tony DeMello is cheering that, our VP of Equity. Chief diversity officer and a champion for minorities at this very big company. So DEI is a thing now, but he was ahead of the curve on that one. Now, at the University of Pennsylvania, he chaired the board of trustees, which is his training in politics, for many, many years. He also sat on the board of its medical school, more training. He has an honorary degree from UPenn, where he also got his law degree, and his BA is from Swarthmore College, where he helped out on student council. And I discovered his claim to fame was writing a 300-page report that tried to answer the question, what do students really want on campus? So maybe we'll find out what they want at TMU. Today, Ambassador, welcome to the Democracy Forum at Toronto Met.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I will sit down in a minute, but just a bit of housekeeping first. Thank you for coming in the election home stretch. We really appreciate it. So I'll kick off the questioning, then we'll open it up to the audience a little later on, so start thinking up what you want to ask. There will not be any live mics, no questions except through Slido, the phone app, which Kareem mentioned, and you can use that screen to figure out how to scan and then submit a question. We've used it before. It works well. It's very democratic. A reminder to everyone in the audience, if you or when you registered and when you checked in, you agreed to abide by our code of conduct. You can ask questions, but people have come here to hear what our guest says, and that's how we roll in a democracy forum. One last programming note, our guest is a diplomat, and under American law, it's called the Hatch Act, sounds very sinister. He is required to be nonpartisan, but I'm not too worried because I don't think he would have come all this way if he didn't have something important to say. So thank you. I'm going to hustle over here and ask the first question, which is to talk to us about democracy. And we're now 4 weeks out, 4 weeks away from Election Day and a very crazy, exciting campaign. We're 4 years out from 4 years away from the last election campaign, which turned out to be crazy, violent in the end. And I'm wondering how you can reassure us, reassure yourselves, and reassure your Canadian neighbors that democracy is going to be okay for you and for us.
So I will give a disclosure at the outset. I like to view myself as a glass half full kind of guy. And my friends tell me it's nice to say that, but I'm actually a glass sort of all full kind of guy. And that is certainly the case when I think about the future of America and the future of democracy. I've been a fan of democracy for as long as I've thought about this issue. One of my favorite historical figures is Winston Churchill, and of course, he has the famous comment, by the way, it is not his line, for the record. He was actually quoting an unnamed person in 1947, also a big fan of democracy, at a time when the world needed democracy, I would argue just like today, where he made the observation, I won't quote it, but says that, democracy is a horrible form of government. It's messy and ugly and difficult, and it's just a horrible form of government until you look at all the other forms of government. And I, as typically Churchillian as that was, I subscribe to the same view.
I've used that quote so many times in my columns, I've been ordered by my editors to stop repeating myself.
Right.
So you have a room full of Democrats, believers, true believers here, but they're all worried. So how do you reassure us?
Okay, so the reassurance is simple. The United States just celebrated its 248th birthday, 248 years. Over that period of time, we've grown and developed into what I think most would accept as the world's most significant and enduring democracy. And we have had challenges to democracy throughout our history. The Civil War, which tore our country apart. And at the time, a lot of people said the United States isn't going to survive. Isn't going to survive this. This will be the death of the United States. 2 world wars, the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which also threatened to tear our country apart. Senator Joseph McCarthy and his war on quote-unquote communists. Anyone who he didn't agree with could be labeled a communist, be ostracized, lose their jobs. A lot of people thought that was going to destroy the United States.
I'm feeling like the glass is almost empty now.
Right? But the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Again, the conventional wisdom is the United States going to survive this? And now we have a turbulent decade of contention in our government systems and our government structures, where again the question is being asked, does the United States survive? Does the United States democracy survive? And Canadians and the rest of the world and Americans should all take comfort in the fact that with all those challenges, and I could do 10 more, the United States has always survived. The United States has gotten through those movements, and we've come out on the other side stronger than where we were before we went into those battles. Our democracy stronger and more enduring, and I have not 90% confidence, not 95% confidence, I have 100% confidence that the United States will come out at the other end of these elections with a enduring and surviving democracy that is even stronger than it was before we went into this.
So democracy is really important to you and to your president. He held a couple of global democracy summits, which our prime minister attended. Correct. And yet when you look around the globe, democracy seems to be slipping more than ever. So what's going wrong globally then?
Okay, so I think that there may be some slippage in democracy. There are challenges to democracy, which is the reason why these global summits on democracy were called. I will note, I think it's important, more than 100 countries participated in the global summits for democracy.
Some were dropped from the list at the last minute.
But more than 100 participated. By the way, that's the nature of democracy. Democracy doesn't mean that everyone gets to play. Democracy means it is open, and everyone in those summits didn't necessarily agree on exactly how to pursue and to defend democracy. I take the story with the slippage of democracy, as the president has said, as Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has said, that democracy isn't free. It's not something that's just there. Nobody should take it for granted. It can be under challenge. And America has taken on the obligation to fight for the preservation of democracy and the extension of democracy. Canada has taken the view that it wants to be a part of that battle and join in that. And 100 countries joined the global summits for democracy to join that battle and to fight for democracy. And to me, that's the relevant part of the story.
Okay,
we recognize as a battle, but we're going to take that battle on, and in the end, we're going to come out stronger than we went into it.
So the battle has been joined, but there continues to be slippage, and what's interesting is the resilience of populism. So let's talk about populism for a moment, and some of the right-wing populism, not just in America, but around the world. What's going on there? Is it a challenge, or is the question about a particular political party, let's say the Republican Party in the US, or is it a broader-based movement that is organic and very resilient around the world?
So I think it's pretty clearly the latter. I think what is happening...
You mean a movement?
And it's around the world. It's a global issue. And it's hard to define. I mean, you've set it up 100% correctly, which is it is hard to define the causes and direction of a global movement of populism. Because almost by definition, it's as a movement and as rooted in populism, it's not easily definable. And it's not the Republican Party in the United States. It's not the Conservative Party in Canada. There is a rise of more conservative-based populism in many countries around the world. And look, I mean, I don't want to keep saying the same thing, but it is honest. I mean, it is something I'm concerned about because you can't help but look at it and sort of say what's happening, what is causing this to happen. And by the way, I think there are things that are causing this to happen too. I think it's a troubled world. I think there are a lot of institutionalized governments and leadership, and I think there's a resentment to bigness, to institutionalized power. There's a desire for change. But I think the dominant cause and the dominant fuel for these movements is fear. And it's economically based fear. It is the old fear. I mean, one of my favorite, I used to read a lot of polls. I don't do that anymore. Still read some. But it is that old favorite polling question about, is the country headed in the right direction, wrong direction? And the question of, are you doing better than your father? Sorry, but polling questions tend to ask it as father. They've tended to go to father and mother now in some polls. And then the question of, do you expect your children to do better than you? And there's been a fairly dramatic reversal of that question in the United States, in Canada, and all around the world, where it used to be this sort of relentless positive cycle of optimism that you're doing better than your parents and that you're expecting your children to do better than you. And that question is on its head now. It's turned on its head now. That is not the view, and I think it is that fear that provides the fertile ground for growth of these populist movements. But at the end of the day, and I think it is, I'm not trying to brag here, I'm not trying to look at the world through rose-colored glasses. It is because of the United States leadership. It is because of the coalition that the United States has been able to assemble. And this is bipartisan. As I said, there's no greater, I mean, obviously Joe Biden has made this a principal element of his presidency, but there's no greater believer or defender of democracy than Mitch McConnell. And Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell may not agree on a lot of substantive things, but the one thing they agree on is the importance of democracy and the importance of the American role in promoting and defending democracy around the world. And because of that leadership at the end of the day, I do think democracy will prevail. It's not going to be easy. It's not easy today. It's not going to be pretty necessarily. There are going to be examples where, in particular countries, where it doesn't prevail for some period of time. But in the end, the institution and the values underlying democracy will prevail.
We'll circle back to polling in a couple of minutes. But 4 years ago, before the last election, we had the previous Canadian ambassador to Washington, David McNaughton, as one of our guests. We were talking about American polarization and the crossover into Canada. And we've had a convoy in Ottawa while you were there occupying our capital. So as an American who is paid to watch our country close, because most Americans would have to be paid to pay attention to Canada, we know that, how do you see our Canadian polarization comparing to American polarization? What's the difference here?
So I'm not 100% sure that I'm completely comfortable answering that question yet. I've only been here 3 years. I've seen a lot. My perception is that polarization is worse in the United States now than it is in Canada. Hard to measure that, but that is my perception. I would say that if you eliminated question period, that the polarization in Canada is it may be there, but it's a lot less visible. And as ugly as question period can be, when you look at the big issues, there's less polarization in Canada than there is in the United States. There's sort of stunningly, neither side may want to admit it, but there's stunningly broader agreement about the end state around some of these big issues between or among Conservative Party, the NDP, the Liberal Party, than there is disagreement.
So
What there is, and I want to say this because these are different things, what there is that is common between the United States and Canada, and it's hard to say which one is better or worse, is a loss of civility in the dialogue that takes place around these important issues.
Yes.
And that's something that is hard for me to take because there's no reason for it.
When I lived overseas, I realized I was watching CNN International, which is different from CNN Domestic, which is different from Fox TV. Everyone says Americans watch too much cable news. I'm watching a lot of it now because of the election homestretch. Do Canadians watch too much American cable news?
So this is something on which I have a firm opinion, in which I have described, which is, and I'm making this statement as you said. I was chair of Penn Medicine, so I'm not a doctor, but I like to think that I have a bit of an amateur medical degree, and I would strongly make the diagnosis that Canadians watch far too much American cable news. And one of the reasons I say that is that the Canadians are watching this news without the context of living in the country. Americans may watch too much of that news too, but they live in the country. They're talking to other people. They're experiencing what the cable news is covering. They bring some American context to watching the cable news. Canadians don't have any of that. So they have none of the context other than what they see on cable news. And I don't even know if this exists, to be perfectly candid, but I have not seen ratings. But my strong suspicion, based on my own experience, is that Canadians are watching far too much American cable news on CNN and MSNBC. I mean, they're not, in the United States, it's maybe hard for you to believe, but Fox News is by far the highest rated American cable news channel. So Canadians may watch Fox News, but not as much as they watch MSNBC and CNN. This is sort of against my interest as a former senior executive in the company that owns MSNBC, but no offense, nighttime MSNBC is not necessarily like the core be-all and end-all of an accurate picture of what politics and policy in the United States is.
You talked about the differences and commonalities between our two countries and that we're not as polarized. One of the most polarizing issues in America is, of course, immigration. There's more of a consensus, or traditionally was more of a consensus among Canadian leaders on immigration, our Conservative, our NDP, our Liberal parties. If Trump becomes president and deports 11 million people, how would Canada react to that? How strong is that immigration consensus in Canada? How fragile is it, considering that we have America as this massive geographic buffer from other, I mean, we have splendid isolation here in Canada from immigration challenges that Europe and America have. How would we do when we're tested?
So I'm going to answer that question, but I'm going to ignore the part of that question that is not appropriate for me to react to. The clause that started of if former President Trump ...
That's how we do question period in Canada, but yeah, ignore the question, absolutely.
Yeah, well, and look, you said this, and I want and I need to be very careful about my role as ambassador and avoiding political and partisan commentary. By the way, I have unbelievable respect for the Hatch Act, but I hate to say this, I have even more respect for my reputation as a diplomat. When I was in the United States, I was extremely active in politics, and a lot of people like to hear me as a political commentator. In Canada, nobody's interested in their diplomats being a political commentator, no matter how interested they are in American politics. I don't think it's what I'm here for. So I want to be really careful about that. In terms of what I think the Canadian reaction would be to this, I'm not sure I'm sufficiently expert to be able to answer that. I think Canada culturally, as you said, seems to have had a very different attitude toward immigration, ingrained for a very long time, much more open and embracing of immigration historically. And you look at the numbers, I mean, Canada was peaking at 1 million new Canadians a year. By the way, as someone who is into messaging, my PD team will be very happy to hear me say that and know how important messaging is. I actually applaud and I love the fact that Canadians talk less about immigrants and more about new Canadians, because I think that's a much more, I mean, if you're going to be serious about how we want to embrace immigrants coming to our country, one of the best ways to do that is to call them new Canadians, not to call them immigrants. Immigrants has a tone of interlopers, of people coming to the country, of being different than people who have been here longer. And so I think that is part of the cultural acceptability and acceptance of new Canadians here in Canada. And I do think there appear to be some shifts in those attitudes towards new Canadians, in particular in certain provinces in Canada, not necessarily on a national level.
Which provinces?
Well, I mean, Quebec is obviously the principal example of this, and it's not a criticism of Premier Legault or of Quebec, because I think there's a decent case to be made that Quebec as a province has borne the brunt of some of the more challenging of the new Canadians that have come into the country, and then you can get into an argument about resources. I'm wandering a little bit here, but it all ties together, because one of the other really nice things about Canada, really constructive things about Canada, one of the things that Canada does well is that their policy toward immigration and your policy toward immigration, toward being open to new Canadians, is coupled with a real commitment, a country commitment backed up by dollars of providing support to new Canadians, which has a very significant price tag to it. I've visited multiple new Canadian centers, and I see the language training, the job training component, the housing assistance, the counseling component of this. So there's a policy that is backed by a very significant government intervention in ensuring that new Canadians will be successful. A lot of that is borne by the provinces. And so you can see a province In the United States, we call these unfunded mandates, but you can see a province rebelling, saying we've got a policy to welcome all these new Canadians. We've got a culture and government and federal government mandates to provide support for these new Canadians, and we're being left to pick up a disproportionate financial share that we can't afford as a province. I mean, I think that's the genesis of some of this pushback. So it's in that environment that I think it is, and Canadians watching so much American cable news, that I think does present a risk how changes in U.S. immigration policy, no matter who creates them or no matter who causes them, Canadians probably pay more attention to them than you would expect. And when those are happening against the context of some raw nerves around Canadian immigration policy, there is certainly a risk for exacerbation of some of the tensions in Canada around immigration and immigration policy.
Yeah. You mentioned polling a minute ago. You said that you love polls in your previous life.
I used to love polls.
So we ran a poll in the Toronto Star last week that showed Canadians are 3 times more positive about Kamala Harris than Donald Trump. And she'd win in a landslide in Canada, but we don't vote. Even conservative voters here, conservative supporters, prefer the Democrats over the Republicans. So what's that about?
So I saw the poll. I saw your poll.
Thank you for reading the Toronto Star.
Right. I do, by the way, I can show it. I might show it on my phone if I had it in my pocket. I've got the app.
Bless you.
Every morning I get the newsletter. It is one of the first things I read every day. Sorry, Globe and Mail. Not really. I have the Globe and Mail app on my phone too, but they don't. You have that neat little morning newsletter where in 5 minutes I can get all the top stories in Canada, which works very well for my schedule.
What a great guest.
Right. But I mean, I actually don't know enough to answer that question. And I always think it's, first of all, I look at a lot of polls. I think it's always hazardous to look at polls like that because, again, there's an absence of context in that question. As you said, Canadians don't vote, but Canadians also don't bear a direct burden or a direct benefit of anything that the candidates are talking about and doing. And so I think polling popularity of elected officials or politicians in one country relating to another country, I think is always very hazardous, and it's hard to draw conclusions from that. I might have some opinions on it, but I might have some opinions on it based on Canadians' prior perceived experience with Donald Trump as president. But it's something I'm not comfortable getting into because I think it's a little bit too political for my taste.
Okay, it was a trick question, and you didn't bite. However,
I diplomatically dodged it.
However, when I looked at some of your pronouncements over the last year, it looks like you lowered your guard last year to an audience of Canadian businessmen and women. And you said that you had looked at so this was late last year, and you said, quote, "The polling results are sobering and scary," quote unquote.
Actually, unfortunately, I don't
Politico.
think you were at that audience. I don't think
No, I
you
think
were
it was
there.
Politico last year.
No, I don't think you were at that event.
Okay.
So you were relying on Politico reporting of what I said, which was not complete. Because I did say that, but the beginning sentence was,
Context.
if you are a Joe Biden supporter or in the Joe Biden campaign, the recent polling results are sobering. I stand by that.
Any better now?
The polling results? Well, I think the polling results now are pretty consistent with what I'm getting borderline into political commentary, but it's not going to be a political comment, which is I think the polling results now are consistent with what I view the United States electorate as being, which is we're a 50-50 country. And I think the polling results reflect that we are a 50-50 country.
So can we talk a little bit, without getting you in trouble, about your life before becoming ambassador? You became a very successful fundraiser for Barack Obama and then for Joe Biden. I think you held his first fundraiser. Why was it important for you back then, before you were a diplomat, before the Hatch Act was handcuffing you? Why was it important for you to fundraise at such a high level for Obama and for Biden?
So I liked your predicate to your question, which was not to get me in trouble under the Hatch Act. I'm not quite sure your question delivered on that commitment, but I can provide an answer to that question, which I think is maybe helpful to the audience, which is one of the big differences between the United States and Canada in politics is the role of money and the role of money in campaigns. And part of that is history and culture, part of that is legal structure. But historically, as a extremely significant fundraiser, and by the way, in way more than presidential elections, most of my fundraising has not been done in presidential elections, which I think goes to a really important point that I'm going to make here, and if you want to talk about it more, which is the fixation in Canada on the outcome of a presidential election in November is also misplaced. And it comes from that out-of-context viewing of American cable television. There are a lot of elections going on in November. A third of the United States Senate is up for election. Every member of the U.S. House of Representatives is up for election. 19 governorships are up for election. Countless mayors, state legislatures, city councils are up for election. And in the United States, political power is considerably more diffused than it is in Canada. All those elections matter. And one of the reasons for my confidence in the durability and stability of the American political system, and frankly, the durability and consistency of the U.S.-Canada relationship in the wake of this election, is because all those elections are in play, and they all matter in defining those relationships. Most of my fundraising, my political fundraising, was probably Senate fundraising. Certainly was congressional fundraising. So I'll tell you a story. You referenced my career with Ed Rendell, who was the mayor of Philadelphia. So in 1991, which is 35 years ago, I ran his campaign for mayor. And in that campaign, at the time Philadelphia was the 5th largest city in America. And in that campaign, we raised and spent $40 million to get Ed Rendell elected mayor of the city of Philadelphia. $40 million. And it wasn't that stunning a number. $40 million. I pulled this out because these numbers are so stunning. So we'll give you, just to give you a sense of what's going on in the United States this year in terms of presidential fundraising and presidential money. So according to our Federal Election Commission reports, in the period of January 1, 23 through June 30, 24, there are 8,540 federal political action committees, and they reported raising a total of $7.3 billion toward this election cycle, of which they've already spent $6 billion. They also have debts, et cetera, but they have cash on hand of $2.6 billion going into the last few months of this campaign. That is how consequential money is in American politics. And I want to defend that. I don't want to say I think that's good. Frankly, I'm not sure it is good. I don't want to comment on it either, but it is so different than what exists in Canada. And if you want to support a candidate in a big election, whether it's a Senate candidate, a presidential candidate, or what, the best way that a single individual or that a group of individuals can have an impact on an election is to raise money, because you need the money to be able to be successful. And so I'm proud of my record as a political fundraiser because I have been able to raise a lot of money for candidates who I support, who I think are important and who are important for the direction of our country. And although I have raised a lot of money for Barack Obama, I've raised a lot of money for Bill Clinton, if you want to go back another president. I've raised a lot of money for Joe Biden. I've raised a lot of money for Bob Casey, the senator in Pennsylvania. I don't want anyone to walk out of the room on me. I've raised a lot of money for Rick Santorum, former conservative Republican senator of Pennsylvania. I've raised a lot of money for Pat Toomey as a congressman and as a senator in Pennsylvania. Pat Toomey in particular is one of my best friends in politics, continues to be so. And I didn't do it for this reason, but you referenced my unanimous confirmation by the United States Senate. I will tell you, and this is well known in Washington, my strongest, most visible supporter for prompt confirmation in the United States Senate was Pat Toomey. And he didn't do that because I raised a lot of money for him. He did that because I was a friend, because he thought I would be a good ambassador, and I raised money for him because I thought he was a good senator for Pennsylvania. So that's why I raise money. I raise money because it's the most tangible way that I can demonstrate my support for people who I think will do a good job for Philadelphia, for Pennsylvania, and for the country.
So this is interesting because, first of all, I brought some numbers. So thank you for saving me from having to recite the numbers as well, because they are mind-boggling, and it's great context for our audience. The billions of dollars, and you're quite right. It's roughly, I think it's $4 billion for a presidential campaign, but it's another $10 billion for the congressional races at least, and the average Senate race is in the tens of millions of dollars. In a way, you anticipated my next question because you said, I'm not going to defend it. And I was going to ask you, well, how do you defend it? But how do you explain it? Are people who believe in democracy, who believe in their candidates, are you trapped by money politics now? Can you not get out of it?
So I think the big issue here in the United States is our Constitution and our legal structure. The Supreme Court of the United States has repeatedly and consistently held that there are just harsh limitations on how you can limit people spending their own money on politics and political campaigns. So in the United States, we do have what are allegedly strict limitations on how much any individual can give to any candidate, to a presidential candidate, a Senate candidate, whatever that is. The problem is the Supreme Court has decided that it is unconstitutional in the United States to limit the amount of money that any individual can spend independently, and is independent of the candidate or the campaign on any campaign. So that, let me give you an example. If the United States law applied in Canada, and Elon Musk decided that he was completely offended, hypothetically, by the digital sales tax in Canada, and that he was going to
more than hypothetical, but keep going.
He was going to take out Chrystia Freeland. Under United States rules, he could go and spend $50 million in her riding and put up a candidate to defeat her. He could spend $100 million. He could spend whatever he wanted. And if he identified 10 liberals who were supportive of the DST effort, he could go into their ridings and put $10 million in each of their ridings, run another candidate against those candidates, as long as he didn't coordinate with those candidates, as long as he did it on his own. And you could arguably fundamentally change the makeup of Parliament by individuals going in, and by I say individuals, there are super PACs in the United States. So Elon Musk, a bunch of, I don't want to name a real name, but a bunch of Canadian businessmen who were concerned about the direction of the Liberal government could go and create a super PAC. They could raise $100 million, and they could spend it to run candidates against and elect candidates against incumbent members of Parliament. That is the United States structure. You can't do that in Canada. There are laws against doing that in Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that those laws are legal in limiting the amount of money that anyone can spend on any campaign in Canada. So once you don't have those rules, it's almost an irresistible temptation for people who have money to spend the money. By the way, this started, so you know, with the question of whether corporate PACs and labor unions could spend significant amounts of money, and it is now spread to the Elon Musks and the Sheldon Adelsteins, and now the widow of Sheldon Adelsteins, spreading this money around in such significant ways. So why does it happen? Because it's an inevitable and inexorable path of the money finding the loopholes in the law and the way to be able to influence elections. And when you have responsible people who might be willing to stand up and say, we don't want to do this, it's called unilateral disarmament. Because if I were to stand up and say, now I'm not participating, but if I was not in this job, if I were to say I'm not going to participate in these kinds of activities and try and lead an effort for people who were politically like-minded with me not to participate in these efforts, if the other side is still doing it, you're unilaterally disarming, giving the other side an advantage, and a significant advantage, and that's why people don't do it. So the way to fix it is through a constitutional amendment. And again, the beauty of the United States, the durability of the United States, is how hard it is to amend the Constitution.
We don't like to talk about constitutional amendments in Canada either. It's pretty hard. Okay, before we go to the floor, I do want to ask a couple of rapid-fire questions. Like every American ambassador, you, I assume, have spent some time with our Premier, Doug Ford. Have you been to his house in Etobicoke? Tell us about your interactions with him.
So I have spent some time with your Premier. I like him a lot. I have not been to his home. He obviously has a huge affection for the United States and has spent a lot of time in the United States when he was in the private sector. He actually spent a lot of time in Philadelphia because his company spent a lot of time in South Jersey, right across the river from Philadelphia. So we had a lot of interesting conversations about his favorite restaurants in Philadelphia.
And his favorite governors. He knows a couple of governors.
Right.
He knows Tim Walz. He knows the governor of Illinois, I believe.
Well, so at the time, even though I knew Tim Walz before he was governor, at the time, Tim Walz might not have been at the top of our list of governors to talk about. So we didn't do that. But I do have a good Premier Ford story, which is that
Do tell.
Which is that when I visited him, he had a gift for me. I like giving gifts. He likes giving gifts, and his gift to me, which was perfect, knowing I was a sports fan, his gift to me was a CFL football. And before he inscribed it to me and gave it to me, we had a catch in his office, which I think panicked his staff and panicked my staff. I mean, here are these two, well, he's more of an athlete than I am, but here is this untested athlete tossing a football around in the Premier's office. But we had a good time, and neither one of us broke anything.
It's one of the great differences between Canadians and Americans is the sizes of our footballs.
Right, and it was easier for me to, it's easier for me to catch that smaller football.
That's why we need a bit of help.
And then he inscribed it to me, and it is proudly sitting in a case in my office in Ottawa, in the embassy.
Here's a tougher question for you. Quick question, but a tough one.
Tough question?
This is a tough one. Kamala Harris talked at the Democratic Convention about her journey as a child. You can guess where I'm going here. She talked about moving with her mother from California to Illinois to Wisconsin. Quote, and wherever our parents' jobs took us, unquote. So no mention of her time at Westmount High in Montreal. So what's that about? Is it political poison for an American presidential candidate to admit that they spent 4 of their formative years in Montreal? How do you explain that to this tough crowd?
Right. I don't think it's political poison for any political candidate to mention that they spent time in Canada. I think the simplest explanation of that really goes back to something that you said before, which is how much attention Americans pay to Canada, which is not a lot. And if you're trying to make music through political speeches, mentioning places like Wisconsin and Illinois is going to resonate a lot more with American voters than mentioning places in Canada. So I think it's all a matter of rhythm and music. I don't want to get into politics, but I think it is fine for me to say. Actually, it's fine for me. It's easy for me to do because in J.D. Vance, you certainly have someone who has his own affections for Canada, and who does talk about Canada and his Canadian experience. I happen to know on a personal level that Kamala Harris very much appreciates and enjoyed her experience in Canada. I had the honor of my ceremonial swearing in. My formal swearing in had to take place earlier, but my formal ceremonial swearing in on the day before I flew to Ottawa was by Kamala Harris. And that swearing in, we talked about her experience in Canada, her experience in Montreal, and I said, so you have to come and visit me. And she said to me, I would really look forward to doing that. We haven't pulled that off in 3.5 years, but scheduling is never easy. But she has a lot of affection for the time that she spent in Canada.
Montrealers are hurt. I'm from Montreal. Serious quick question, and I know then we'll go just a quick answer, and then we'll go to the questions from the floor. I did promise that we would ask you about being Chief Diversity Officer. What did you do? How did you do that?
So I became the de facto Chief Diversity Officer at Comcast in 2010, which was in the middle of the acquisition of NBC Universal. I tell the story that where that came from is when Comcast didn't have a Chief Diversity Officer at the time. I don't know that any company had a Chief Diversity Officer. I don't know that the title existed. Certainly didn't exist at Comcast. And I was talking with Brian Roberts, who was the CEO of the company. I had already been talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion, making the company more diverse. By the way, more than its people, but making its people more diverse, its supplier network more diverse, making its cable channel lineup more diverse. As I said, we were in the middle of the NBC Universal transaction, and the subject of diversity in the media, diversity in the news, diversity in primetime entertainment programming, diversity in the movie studio was a subject of congressional questions and inquiry. And I had made the case internally in the company that we had a unique opportunity to make Comcast NBC Universal a model of what diversity and inclusion should be in corporate America. And I made the case that I believe that I wasn't making a political statement, I wasn't making a value statement, but that a company that was more diverse, more inclusive, would be a better company, be easier to recruit, easier to retain, that at the end it would be more nimble in decision making, we'd be smarter in decision making because of the different perspectives that would be brought to bear, and at the end of the day, we would have better financial results as a result of having a more diverse and inclusive environment. And Brian, I remember the meeting, Brian looked at me and he goes, that all sounds completely right, and I think you just volunteered to spearhead these efforts. And I said, I'm happy to do it. And so I like to say I sort of appointed myself to this role, and a couple years later, we actually created a title but although I was doing the title I was doing the work from really before 2010, but officially starting in 2010.
Okay, I'm going to take some questions here. Jerry Jang asks, with decreasing voter turnout among young adults, what strategies do you believe could be effective in increasing youth involvement in politics and elections?
So again, if I can, I'm going to ignore the first half of that question, just because it gets me into an area that I don't feel particularly comfortable. But I think it's fine for me to talk about the following, which is, I've said I'm a passionate believer in democracy. An essential hallmark of democracy is to have the broadest possible participation in the political process, to have the broadest possible participation in process outside of politics, in community and engagement. And so I do give a lot of thought to what does it take to broaden participation in the political process, participation in civic process, participation in support of nonprofits, community-based organizations. And I'm not sure there's rocket science to this, but broadening participation is all about creating an environment and making arguments and working on issues that have a broad appeal, and to provide an opportunity for the people you're trying to engage to feel like there's meaningful engagement, that it's not just lip service, that there is a difference that can be made, that they're being listened to, that they're being respected. And I actually think the political process is often one of the better environments where that can happen, and where there can be real thought being to improving engagement strategies. I will say, and I might not have known this 3 years ago, but I will say I think this is one of the strengths of diplomacy for the United States around the world, and I think it's one of the real strengths of Mission Canada, where we put a huge investment on what we call our public diplomacy function, which is a huge part of which is about engaging the Canadian public and engaging the Canadian public in explaining, understanding what United States foreign policy is, what the United States stands for, and and we have a number of strategic objectives in that space as a mission, but I'll call out two. One is what I'll call the big substantive, more trade-oriented objective, which is a building back better philosophy, building back better off of the pandemic. And we have a huge priority to make sure that we don't forget the word better in building back better. We don't just want to build back the economy the way it was before. We want to build the economy back better. And our interpretation of that is to make sure that we're building it back inclusively and that we're building it back so that everybody has the opportunity to participate in that recovery, with a particular focus on SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, and particularly those owned by women, people of color, indigenous peoples, and other underrepresented groups. So it's one of our engagement strategies. The other is around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which is something we work on internally, but it is also something we work on externally. I think my team is ready to kill me, but there isn't a speech that I give, and I can now include this presentation where I don't take the opportunity to talk about DEIA as a core value of the United States, happens to be a value that's shared by Canada, and emphasize the importance of that value as a part of our battle and our fight to nurture and to extend democracy around the world.
On diversity, quickly, a follow-up. We do land acknowledgements all over Canada. I don't hear them very much in America, sometimes, but rarely. How come?
I think it is very rare, and I think this is part of the culture. By the way, you do land acknowledgements all over Canada, but not everywhere in Canada. There are many places I go in Canada where they do not do land acknowledgements. So, there's a diversity of view in Canada. By the way, you do more land acknowledgements in political circles and in academic circles than arguably anywhere else. So maybe that's a place where there's better sensitivity. United States, it is rare that there's a land acknowledgement. I don't know, I've spoken hundreds of times in Canada, thousands of times in the United States. I don't think I've ever given a land acknowledgement in the United States. And do
you want to see them in America?
I'm actually not sure. Okay. I don't have any. By the way, I haven't heard. I've done a lot of work in the diversity and inclusion space with Native American tribes, and in my pen space with Native American tribes in the United States. I have not heard from Native American tribes that they're looking for land acknowledgements. Yeah. And frankly, when I'm at events where Native Americans are speaking, I don't hear land acknowledgements from them either. So a lot of this is cultural.
It's a Canadian, Australian, right. New Zealand.
Right, but by the way, I have to say on a personal level, I find it attractive. And I'll give you an example. One of the places where I always do land acknowledgements is at the annual Embassy July 4th event, which is the premier external Canadian event that the United States Mission to Canada does in Canada every year. We not only do a land acknowledgement, but we have integrated Indigenous voices and traditions into the ceremony. So 2 years ago, part of our musical act was Indigenous throat singers. And we have not only a land acknowledgement, but we have a blessing from an elder. And we talk about reconciliation as part of the short program that takes place at the ceremony. And I do that out of respect for the fact that I'm in Canada and for the importance of reconciliation. But frankly, I do it out of respect for the Indigenous peoples who were here centuries, millennia before white Canadians were, before new Canadians were, and certainly before I was. And I think that respect is important.
I feel like we've Canadianized you a little bit in these 3 years.
I view that as a good thing.
Here's a quick question. As a diplomat, from Larry Krimis, as a diplomat, how do you navigate tough topics of Canadian policies that cause headaches for the U.S.? For example, Canadian temporary immigrants overflowing to the U.S. border.
So I've learned that I don't know how to give a short answer, so I'm tempted to give a short answer to that, which is I handle them diplomatically. I can expand on that a little bit. So I'm a big context person. I've mentioned that in response to the question about cable television news. And so all those issues that come up, I love talking about the closeness of the relationship between the United States and Canada. I quote the president repetitively on his line, which he cited at least 5 times by my count when he visited Canada, which is that the United States has no better friend, partner, or ally than Canada. I quote that all the time. And so I start from that as a context, and I look at our areas of disagreement, and within the context of that overall relationship, I try and put them in context there, and I analogize our friendship and our relationship that we're like a family. We are truly like a family. And I ask you all to think about your family. Do you always agree with everything that every member of your family ever says? Or at your Canadian Thanksgiving dinner table, at your Christmas table, do you every once in a while, do you have disagreements? Do people come at it a different way? Do you have difference of opinion on the carbon tax? Do you have a difference of opinion on immigration policy in Canada? Of course you do. We have disagreements all the time. But does that cause you to storm out of the room and not talk to each other for a month? Of course not. You sit and you talk about it. It's a topic of conversation. And that's what we do between the United States and Canada. I just was just in another luncheon, talking about this, and I got a similar question to this. And my answer was, the rest of the world, Parliament in Canada, the United States Congress, could take a lesson in the civil way in which the United States and Canada handle our disagreements and handle the disputes that we might have. We have figured out a way to do this civilly, to talk them through. No offense, sometimes that means talking them through privately, not trying to negotiate them in the newspapers or on television. And the net result of that has been a strengthening of this relationship and the creation of a bilateral relationship that is truly the envy of the world.
Ambassador, there are a lot of other disagreements to talk about, and there was a long list, but we've been saved by the bell. But there is no more profound disagreement, I think, than on which is the real Thanksgiving. You mentioned that there's a difference of opinion there, which I think will go unresolved. So that's all the time we have for questions.
I have to give a snide answer to that, which is in the U.S. Embassy, in the U.S. mission to Canada, there's no difference of opinion on that. What all our workers, all our employees think is this is fantastic. We get 2 Thanksgivings.
Yeah.
Because both are official Mission Canada holidays.
I could see that coming. Diplomacy has its ways. Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. A quick reminder that we have 2 more democracy forums coming up this month on October 25th with Mayor Olivia Chow and Marshall Gans. And then on October 30th, we have 3 of Canada's top labor leaders from Unifor, the Canadian Labour Congress, and OPSU. I'm handing it off now to my colleague, Karim Bardisi. Before I do, just want to cheat, and thanks to Karim and the entire team for supporting the Democracy Forum, to our guest for coming really in the home stretch of the U.S. election campaign, and to our audience for being so democratic. So thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Ambassador, and to the Consul General. The Ambassador has to catch a flight soon, but I think a few of us will still be around for the milling and froing that we do around here. Thanks to all the daisies, all the folks at the team at the dais who put on the TMU Democracy Forum, as well as to DMZ, our hosts, to all the TMU staff, including Roberta and Tony DeMello, who joined us, the teams from the consulate and the embassy. As Martin mentioned, the next TMU Democracy Fora, because there are 2. Friday, October 25th, noon to 1 with, it's also a dais book talk with legendary community organizer and mentor to a couple of us, Marshall Gans, in conversation with Martin and Mayor Olivia Chow. And then Wednesday, October 30th, with Lana Payne, JP Hornick, and Bia Bunsky. And thanks so much for all your attention today. And join us for a future Democracy Forum. Thank you on behalf of the dais.